Hey everybody, a little quick video about relative energy deficiency in sports. In my class this week we talked about female athlete triad, and we kind of ran out of time before we got a chance to look at the next progression in that characterization for athletes, and that's red S. So you may or may not have heard that term red S before. It has been around for greater than a decade now. The IOC actually started looking at this as early as 2005 to update and review the female athlete triad. And what they recognized was that female athlete triad really was only capturing a very small portion of some of the issues we see, particularly in endurance athletes. And it wasn't just limited to female athletes. So this syndrome, if you will, is caused by a lack of energy consumption compared to the amount of energy expenditure that these athletes are routinely exposed to as a result of their training and their competition. So in many instances, the psychological consequences of red S actually precede the onset of the other symptoms, but it's still kind of a chicken or egg phenomenon. So some would say that the psychological symptoms are a result of the syndrome, and others would say the syndrome is a result of the psychological issues. The bottom line here is, unlike female athlete triad, where we're talking about menstrual irregularity, eating disorder, and bone loss, red S really encompasses a number of potential aspects of function. So that can include disordered eating. It can include some hormonal and metabolic imbalance for males or females. And then we also see issues throughout the body, musculoskeletally, cardiovascularly, digestive system, all those things. So if we look at this slide from the British Journal of Sports Medicine, we see that red S is kind of at the center here. Historically, in female athletes, we were concerned about the impact on performance. So we kind of see that up the top, decreased injury performance, and then the increased injury risk, we see that in terms of stress fractures and other kind of cumulative trauma disorders. And then the other aspect we've seen is this decreased training response, where we see that maybe the resting heart rate is elevated. Basically, they just clearly are overtrained. So we see these other aspects that manifest as well. Strength goes down, increased irritability or depression, a decreased ability to concentrate. So this is related to energy balance. It's also related to cortisol levels that kind of go haywire and are elevated within the system. So the key to red S, just like we talked about with female athlete triad, is to try to identify this as early as possible, because the sooner we intervene, usually the more reversible these symptoms are. This may involve a cessation of activity for a while, and that may or may not be supported by your coaching staff or even the athlete, him or herself. Just because the athlete is performing well does not always mean that they are healthy. So there are ways that we can go about monitoring workload. Thankfully, with the advent and onset and widespread embrace of some of the statistical methods of quantifying performance, and the sports science embrace by a lot of the professional and high-level collegiate teams, it's probably more popular or easier than ever to lobby to get an athlete to have some downtime if you're concerned that they're overtrained. We've seen things. I saw a headline just last week that LeBron James was sidelined for a game against the Warriors for workload management. That's not something we saw 5 years ago, certainly 10 or 20 years ago. But the recognition here is that recovery time is in many instances just as important as training time. Some other things that can be done here for female athletes, just like with female athlete triad, oral contraceptives in low dose can be beneficial at regulating the hormone levels. Increasing protein intake, that may be a challenge for some if they're vegan or vegetarian. So looking at protein intake can pose some different challenges for some, but it's still critical so that we're ensuring that anything broken down through training, through competition, is replaced, and we can build tissue instead of tearing it down all the time. Many of these athletes are also going to be on a restricted diet when it comes to dairy, so increasing calcium intake, ideally through food sources, but secondarily if they just can't get it elsewhere, through a supplement. And then last thing, counseling for any of the psychological issues is important, and this needs to be something that we embrace as something relatively regular in sport participation. Psychological issues, depression, inability to concentrate, those can impact sleep habits, they can impact training habits, and ultimately as their healthcare professional, it's going to make things more difficult on you in trying to ensure that they are as healthy as they can be. So don't be afraid to refer, don't be afraid to punt in those instances where you feel like your patient can benefit from it. That's it. This is Brooks signing off. Have a great weekend.